Hey, what's up, everybody? It's OC. Um, just bringing you some updates on this novel coronavirus thing. Hopefully, things aren't as bad as the people are actually making it out to be, which it looks like it kind of is. And unfortunately, our government and our media is downplaying it. Now, just keep understanding, everyone, that the numbers that they're releasing are the numbers of confirmed cases, not actual cases. It's just the confirmed amount. That is the amount of people who were tested. And keep in mind, they ran out of testing supplies very early on. So a lot of people were just kind of diagnosed with it and sent home for isolation when once these facilities that they built and the hospitals that they already had were already at capacity. They have normal life as well going on there. So people are dying of regular things. People are getting sick of regular things that they would have anyway. And then they have this that they're dealing with on top of it. So keep that in mind when you think about it coming here to the United States, which it's already here, but it's just going to take a while for it to spread like that did. But believe it will spread like that, like it did there, anywhere that it touches. It's just going to take a month to do so. So keep your hands washed, keep your hands sanitized, and keep spreading the information about what's really going on. So today we're going to look at what the government is saying about it in their conferences. We're going to look at a biological weapons laboratory here in the United States for comparison as to what it is that they deal with and how often they mess up sometimes, as well as what the government's preparations are in an event like what's happening in China were to happen here. What protocols would happen if something like that was outbreak here in America, what they would be doing. So that way you can kind of look at the politicians and you can look to see what they're doing, because if they're following these protocols, then something is definitely happening, regardless of what the news says. They're only going to do these specific things in the outbreak of something bad happening. May it be, global war or a virus that's gone global. Anytime that there's a chance that the government could be damaged by this, either physically or infrastructure or economically, they will do these protocols. So check it out, you guys. Sit back, watch the videos, and please share this with everyone that you know. Click like, subscribe, all that good nonsense. Click the notification bell so you know when other information is coming out that we've got coming out. And believe we can make a difference, but we must speak up.
I want to talk about the biggest and the most important story in the world, the Wuhan coronavirus. This coronavirus is a catastrophe on the scale of Chernobyl for China, but actually it's probably worse than Chernobyl, which was localized in its effect. The coronavirus could result in a global pandemic. While you were all sleeping overnight, the number of diagnosed cases in China increased by 30%. Now, let me be clear, that's not new cases, that is just newly admitted cases. It is probably several orders of magnitude higher than that. Also, while you were sleeping, China now has its entire border with Russia closed. 2,600 miles, Russia has closed that border. El Al has shut down travel between Israel and China. Air France has shut down travel between China and France. And that's in addition to all the other countries that have already shut down travel. From what we know so far, and there's still many unknowns, this virus could have both a long incubation period, as much as 14 days, and individuals could be contagious while asymptomatic, which was not the case with SARS in 2003. Furthermore, from some cases, it appears the virus could be aerosolized, which means it doesn't require the kind of contact that you have with, say, a married couple kissing each other or a family living in close quarters in a hotel or apartment, but rather the distances we are all sitting apart right now. Yet China is still lying about all of this. They've been lying about it from the very beginning, and you don't need their history of lying about SARS in 2003, though it is relevant here. You just have to see what's happened over the last 2 months. We now know that the first case manifested no later than December 1, even though China didn't reveal it to the WHO until a month later on December 31st, when they continued to hide it from their own citizens. And they continued to say that it had been contained inside Wuhan. Today, it is in every single province in China. They also claimed for almost 2 months, until earlier this week, that it had originated in a seafood market in Wuhan, that locals had contracted it from animals in, say, bat soup or snake tartare. That is not the case. The Lancet published a study last weekend demonstrating that of the original 40 cases, 14 of them had no contact with the seafood market, including patient 0. As one epidemiologist said, that virus went into the seafood market before it came out of the seafood market. We still don't know where it originated. Could have been another seafood market. Could have been a farm. Could have been a food processing company. I would note that Wuhan also has China's only biosafety level 4 super laboratory that works with the world's most deadly pathogens, to include, yes, coronavirus. Now, look at China's own actions. They have quarantined 60 million people, 60 million, more than the entire population of our West Coast. They've shut down schools indefinitely. Classes canceled nationwide indefinitely. Hong Kong, a part of China, has basically shut down all travel from the mainland. That's why it is essential that we immediately stop all travel on commercial aircraft between China and the United States. Making exceptions, of course, for American citizens to come back, as we just brought back yesterday. Allowing essential trade to flow as long as crews on ships and aircraft are not allowed to go into the general population in America. And making exceptions, of course, for medical personnel to go into China to try to get a handle on this. It is essential that we take those steps, and essential that we get to the bottom of China's deceit and incompetence on this measure. And gentlemen, I raise this with you because you are responsible in your combatant commands for some countries that have the most fragile public institutions, to include the most fragile public health institutions in the world. So I ask, even though as of this morning there are not yet confirmed cases of coronavirus in your combatant commands, though I suspect there will be soon, what is your assessment about the ability of the governments in your combatant commands to handle a potential global pandemic like this? General Townsend.
Thanks, Senator. So there are not, that I'm aware of, any confirmed cases, as you mentioned, but there are some suspected cases. The first report of suspected case I've heard of is in Djibouti, which you would imagine with a significant Chinese presence there. So the capacity of African nations to deal with this problem varies widely. For example, in Eastern Africa, Central East Africa, they've been dealing with Ebola, and they've been dealing with Ebola largely on their own and doing a pretty good job of it. So I think capacity there, but anywhere else in Africa is probably not to that degree.
Admiral Fowler.
The Venezuela crisis has already strained the social services of many of the nations. As you're aware, Senator, we had to deploy the hospital ship Comfort twice in 1 year to last deployment 12 different nations, and in one 5-day span it can do the equivalent of a whole month for a region of some of the major countries. So I would be extremely concerned. Like General Townsend, the capacities vary widely, but in many cases they're strained, and to the limit I'd be very concerned if we saw this spread.
Thank you. As a defensive measure, I just say again, it is essential that we shut down all commercial air travel immediately between the United States and China. as an offensive measure, because that probably won't stop it entirely, and because if it becomes a global pandemic, we have to deal with countries with very limited capabilities here. We need a Manhattan Project level effort to work with our best research scientists and laboratories in this country to develop a vaccine as quickly as possible.
In 1968, about 6,000 sheep died near this government facility. They were poisoned by a chemical weapon named VX. The U.S. hasn't been known to actively use VX in combat. In fact, it's begun destroying its stockpile of chemical munitions as part of a UN treaty. But it's just one of many strange and secretive experiments that happened within these walls. Experiments on sheep, mosquitoes, and even civilians. About 85 miles southwest of Salt Lake City is the U.S. government's top secret bioweapons lab. It's called the Dugway Proving Ground. The 77-year-old facility covers about 800,000 acres. That's just a little larger than the entire state of Rhode Island. And it tests some of the deadliest chemical, biological, radiological, and explosive hazards on Earth. Less famous than Area 51, Dugway dates all the way back to 1942, right in the middle of World War II.
The decisive battle of the war has begun.
The government needed a large area to test powerful weapons, eventually settling on this stretch of land in the Utah desert. Back then, the site was used to test everything from chemical sprays and flamethrowers to various antidotes and protective equipment, and even firebombing. After World War II, Dugway mostly shut down until the Korean War began in 1950. That's when the Proving Ground turned into what it is today, a permanent military base. In Dugway's first few decades, the base worked mostly on offensive weaponry, biological and chemical munitions designed to directly attack enemies.
Sampling devices positioned throughout the test area yield valuable information to Chemical Corps researchers.
The 1950s, for example, saw the launch of Operation Big Itch, an experiment that was testing weaponized fleas. The fleas weren't infected with any type of disease or agent, but experimenters were working with thousands of them, and the fleas were dropped in cluster bombs to gauge if they would survive the fall from an airplane. And this was only part one. Dugway launched a second experiment called Project Bellwether in the 1960s. Only this time, mosquitoes were injected with inert diseases, inert bacteria, and inert viruses. But get this, those mosquitoes were released upon several groups of human volunteers who were bitten again and again during the trials. And there are records dating back to the late 1950s, which describe experiments that used infected mosquitoes. And those are just two experiments known to the public. Exactly what goes on at Dugway is, well, pretty unclear. And that's not by accident. The area is intensely guarded. Everything that comes in and out is carefully monitored, guards are on constant patrol and actively armed, and the perimeter is lined with tall barbed wire fencing. There are even signs that authorize deadly force when necessary. Since the 1940s, officials say operations have shifted from offensive to defensive tactics. Case in point, most of the current known work prepares agents to defend against potential biological and chemical attacks. For example, a multitude of training programs are held on site for the armed forces. Here's one in which Army Reserve soldiers are tasked with checking the radiation levels of artillery rounds. And here's another where soldiers were tasked with identifying substances in a simulated chemical lab. Dugway's main operations include the Brock Training Facility, constructed from various shipping containers. It simulates underground environments for military training. There are also various buildings and rooms that serve specific purposes, like the decontamination testing chamber, the wind tunnel testing room, and the material test facility. But perhaps the most interesting room of all is this: the Smart Man Laboratory Facility, which houses the Smart Man Dummy, a model that's used to simulate human contact with chemical agents, including the infamous VX nerve agent. Specifically, the Smart Man helps the lab develop more effective individual protection respiratory equipment, essentially gas masks and the like. A variety of chemists, chemical analysts, and technicians work on site, and the use of airtight chambers and gas masks is not only common, but mandatory. Despite all of this dangerous experimentation, the work done at Dugway hasn't always been properly contained. Remember that sheep incident? That marked the start of a worrisome track record. It happened when overhead planes spewed out the nerve agent into the wind, accidentally sending it into nearby farmland in Skull Valley. Within the next couple of days, farmers found thousands of sheep dead in their fields. The Army compensated the farmers and lent them bulldozers to bury the sheep. But the accident sparked a whole debate on the use of chemical weapons in warfare. Adding on to these questionable practices, a 1994 Senate hearing on veterans' health focused specifically on Dugway veterans and civilians. A report found that people at Dugway were exposed to biological and chemical simulants believed to be safe at the time, but that the Army had later stopped using many of them because they realized they were not as safe as previously believed. One veteran, who was accidentally sprayed in the face with the chemical DMMP in 1984, found himself wheezing and coughing the next day, symptoms that ended up lasting several weeks. Despite this, he was given only cough medicine and antibiotics by the Dugway Army Hospital. The Dugway Safety Office assured him that the chemical was safe, but by 1988, officials at Dugway had re-evaluated the simulant's danger and were concerned it could cause cancer and kidney damage. In 2011, the facility slipped up again. It went on lockdown after workers lost a vial containing the VX nerve agent. Nobody was permitted to enter or exit the facility, not even the employees. And in 2016, the CDC and the Department of Defense launched a major investigation when a review team found that Dugway had been operating dangerously for several years without the government's knowledge. USA Today reported egregious failures by the facility's leadership and staff. The report singled out the head colonel in command at Dugway, Brigadier General William King. The Army's accountability investigation recognized King as unqualified, lacking the education and training to effectively oversee biosafety procedures crucial to Dugway's operation. The report admonished him, saying he repeatedly deflected blame and minimized the severity of incidents. It even says King fails to recognize how serious the incidents truly were. And how serious were the incidents exactly? Well, under King's command, the facility mistakenly shipped live anthrax to other labs, and not just once, but multiple times, for over a decade. That same report revealed that workers had been regularly and deliberately manipulating data in important records. Records meant to verify that pathogens being transported elsewhere were killed and safe for researchers to handle without protective gear. Still, the facility's shady past, secretive operations, and intense surveillance have captured the attention and skepticism of some closer observers, including several conspiracy theorist groups. There are suggestions that the facility is the new Area 51, and the local community has raised their own questions about the facility's operations. Dugway was even featured in an episode of the History Channel's UFO Hunters, in which local residents and UFO watchers were interviewed and footage from the area was examined. It's hard not to wonder when you live in close proximity to such a restricted landscape. Despite these theories, Dugway has expressed a desire to be more transparent. And representatives have said the facility wants to be more a part of the local community by better informing citizens about what exactly goes on there. So far, they've delivered some on that. The facility has its own events page, which lists several events open to the general public and the local Utah community. This year, they're hosting a trail race on the facility grounds. Certainly, today's Dugway is a far cry from the 1940s Dugway, which was entirely closed off to the public. But despite the shift in the level of secrecy, much of Dugway's testing remains classified, preserving the skepticism and mysteriousness surrounding the facility.
This video was made possible by Hover. Get 10% off your custom domain or email from Hover at hover.com/Wendover. When nuclear bombs obliterate the Earth, or a virus wipes out the human race, or robots push mankind out of existence, the US government believes that democracy should continue on. The country believes that, even if the population of the US ceases to exist, the country should go on. Akin to its almost paranoid nature, the US government has a series of defined protocols on how to continue the country when the country is no longer. The continuity of government plans. You probably already know about part of these plans because you probably know about the US president's line of succession. If the president dies, there's a list of 17 people ranging all the way from the vice president down to the Secretary of Homeland Security who would take their place. With such a long list, the chances of the US going without a president are near none. The one time a year when the entire line gathers together, the State of the Union, one individual in the line of succession is appointed designated survivor to wait out in a bunker to run the government if the rest of it dies. But the line of succession is the basic stuff, the stuff people already know. What's far less known is the semi-secret protocols and places the government has spent billions of dollars and decades building. However, until just 60 or 70 years ago, the US felt it was untouchable. At no time in history had an enemy existed as relatively close to the US as during the Cold War. The US's foreign policy always kept in mind that an ocean separated it from its enemies, but with the invention of nuclear bombs, an enemy could go from declaring war on the US to toppling its government in a matter of hours. During these days, the US government began actively preparing for doomsday. There are 4 main bunkers from which the US government would run the country following a world-ending event. The Presidential Emergency Operations Center, Raven Rock Mountain Complex, Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center, and the Cheyenne Mountain Complex. The president is the most important person to survive doomsday, both for symbolic and logistical reasons. If a nuclear warhead is inbound to Washington, he or she would most likely evacuate downstairs from the White House into their underground bunker, but that's not guaranteed. During the Truman administration, the president refused to leave the Oval Office during what was believed to be an attack. This ended up being a false alarm, but some presidents have said that they believe that they should write out an attack with the rest of the population. It's just like saying a captain should go down with their ship. The Oval Office, and even the White House bunker, is not the safest place someone can be during an attack. But morale saves lives, and seeing a president braving out the fight can help create a sense of national unity that would keep the country together. A single person is replaceable, but the government as a whole is more delicate. Raven Rock, Pennsylvania would serve as the underground Pentagon. All the leaders of the armed forces would evacuate by helicopter to this facility in the event of an attack and command their troops across the country and the world. During an attack of an apocalyptic scale, it's likely that martial law would be imposed, meaning that the military would take over day-to-day control of the country. The commanders would have wide-ranging, almost dictatorial powers, and habeas corpus would be revoked. From distributing food to serving as law enforcement to keeping the lights on, the armed forces would truly work on the front lines of rebuilding a destroyed country. The Cheyenne Mountain Complex just out of Colorado Springs, Colorado would serve as the home to NORAD, the agency responsible for controlling and tracking the skies above the US and Canada. So, if the above-ground world proved too dangerous for the country's leadership, these 4 underground bunkers would serve as the home to the bare bones of the US government. but what about the rest of it? Nearly 4.5 million people are employed by the US federal government, and they all work to keep it running. Where would the hundreds of government agencies go? Well, nobody knows exactly, at least publicly, but we do know how they would relocate. You might have heard of the DEFCON system. It makes frequent appearances in movies, but few have heard of COGCON. COGCON is a readiness level system that directs agencies how to prepare for the activation of the government's continuity of government plans. At COGCON 4, the lowest level, every US government agency must be able to relocate to an alternate facility and perform basic functions within 12 hours. It's an incredibly ambitious plan. At COGCON 3, this number goes down to 8 hours, then at COGCON 2 is when things get real. At this level, doomsday is imminent. Every agency has 3 sites for their continuity plan, A, B, and C, and their agency would split into 3 corresponding teams, A, B, and C. The A team would relocate to a secure facility near its normal headquarters, probably bunkers under DC. The B team would relocate near the Mount Weather facility, and the C team would relocate to another undisclosed facility. Each team would be ready to take over operations at a moment's notice. The A team would continue operations for as long as possible, either until they're dead or communications are cut off. Then the B team would seamlessly take over operations. If the B team falls, the C team would serve as the final chance for the survival of the government agency. When the surface of the Earth is unsurvivable, there is one other place to go other than underground: to the sky. The traditional Air Force One has redundancy upon redundancy and most likely dozens of classified defense measures, but there's a different plane from which the president might command the country after doomsday: the Boeing E-4 Advanced Airborne Command Post. It became increasingly clear to leadership under the Carter administration that the bunkers would do little to protect against a direct nuclear strike. In fact, they would just concentrate the very individuals that the enemy would attack into a few holes in mountains. Surviving a nuclear blast while 7 miles above Earth, however, is far more conceivable. This plane is sometimes referred to as Air Force One when it matters. Whenever the president travels, one of these planes is stationed at most a couple hundred miles away. From this plane, the president can command the country indefinitely. It can be refueled mid-air by tanker, so, barring technical issues, it can remain flying for as long as the food and water lasts. In a doomsday scenario, this plane could literally stay airborne for weeks at a time to keep the country's leadership safe. After Armageddon, the United States' goal would be to rebuild the ailing country with however many survivors remained. But how would the country continue as the same country when most everyone was dead? Because of the line of succession, the president could be an unknown, unelected official with a bare-bones government of just a few thousand people. So what's to say to a survivor in Texas or Oregon or Alaska that it's still the same country continuing on? Well, what binds America together is a common culture and legacy. Art and historical artifacts are the physical representations of this, and their survival would pose a powerful message about the State of the Union. On doomsday, resources would be scarce and disjointed, so officials have had to make decisions about which items to save and which would be left behind. For example, priority would be given to Leonardo da Vinci's Ginevra da Vinci over Rogier van der Weyden's St. George and the Dragon, and the Declaration of Independence would be saved before the Constitution. Ideally though, all 3 of the nation's most important documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, would be evacuated from Washington. Grouped together, they would be called Freedom Documents Group 1, and while some high-level officials would evacuate Washington by road, these 3 documents would get their own helicopter straight to Mount Weather to continue the powerful legacy of the United States. Nobody knows exactly how or if the US government will survive doomsday. All we know are some of the plans. Plans are just plans though, and do not account for the unknown. In the event that the United States is truly threatened by nuclear war, pandemic, or any other world-ending event, who knows if the population will even believe that they are still in the United States? Little distinguishes one country from another other than what people think, and if people believe they are part of the country of Alaska or the Kingdom of California, then for the most part, they are. If the principles of separation of power, judicial review, checks and balances, limited government, federalism, and popular sovereignty live on past the end, the continuity of government plans have succeeded, even if the members of government die. These plans are not about saving the president or the Secretary of Defense or any one person. They're about making sure the structure of democratic government continues on.